Hey guys, welcome back. We're still in Unit 2.2, Energy and Matter Flow from Cells to Ecosystem. Today we're going to talk about Part 2, which is on cellular respiration. All right, so let's get going and jump right on in. So first, an intro to cell respiration. Cell respiration is an aerobic process. This means that it needs oxygen in order for it to occur. So what happens is when you eat food, you get glucose, and the glucose is then sent to your cells where it is used to create energy. So the glucose is broken apart, releasing energy, and we use that energy, our cells use that energy to recharge the ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And that's what you see at the bottom here. We have adenosine diphosphate. And what happens there is when energy is released by breaking the bonds of glucose, we can take that energy and store it as a new bond between the last phosphate of adenosine diphosphate and this lonely phosphate right here, turning it into adenosine triphosphate. So ATP. Now ATP is an energy carrying molecule. It provides energy that is used all throughout the cell. So everywhere in your cell where something is happening, a reaction is occurring, we're replicating DNA or making more organelles, all of that requires energy. And everything in your cell only uses one form of energy currency, ATP. Now, how the energy gets released is the ATP is sent out. It'll break that last phosphate off, releasing the energy that was stored in the bond, and that energy will then be used in whichever reaction or organelle needs it. Then the ADP, diphosphate, and the lonely phosphate go back and get recharged. They get more energy added in the form of that third bond, and it just keeps going on in this cycle. Now, this process of cell respiration makes anywhere from 36 to 38 ATP. I've heard most sources citing it as 36, but I have seen some sources citing it as 38. However, for this and for my class, we're going to go with what our textbook says, and that is 36 ATP. Sorry, adjusting the load table here. So here is the reaction, the chemical equation for cell respiration. So we have 6 oxygen gas. Remember, we said that this process is aerobic, so it needs oxygen. We have 6 oxygen gas molecules plus 1 glucose will give us 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules plus 36 ATP. This reaction kind of looks familiar. Remember, back when we were talking about photosynthesis, we said that the equation for photosynthesis is opposite that of cell respiration. Well, this is showing it. Remember, photosynthesis was 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus energy in the form of sunlight will give us 6 oxygen gas plus 1 carbohydrate, specifically glucose. Here we have 6 oxygen gas plus glucose gives us 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus energy in the form of ATP, specifically 36 ATP. There we go. That hopefully helped. All right, so let's move on then, shall we? So let's talk a little bit about cell respiration. First of all, it occurs in the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are those little organelles, kind of looks like this, and most cells will have multiple mitochondria. Some do have more than others. So what is cell respiration? It releases chemical energy stored in glucose bonds in order to make ATP. Now this occurs in both plants and animals. So plant and animal cells both do cell respiration. Plants also do photosynthesis in order to make the glucose for cell respiration. Now we as animals don't need to do that because we get glucose from our diet, but trees, they just don't go out and eat things to get glucose, so they have to make it themselves, and that's what photosynthesis is. After photosynthesis, once it has made, the chloroplast has made the glucose, that glucose is then sent from the chloroplast to the mitochondria to be broken down in order to get the energy. So here's a cell, and you can see we got mitochondria there, there, and there. And that's kind of what it looks like. So it has a two-membrane system, a double membrane, just like the chloroplast did. You have the outer membrane and the inner membrane. You have the cristae, which are, you know, how the bulk, these elongations kind of form little valleys. Let's see. And inside, we have a jelly-like substance called matrix or mitochondrial matrix. We also do have some proteins like ATP synthase. We have the intermembrane space. We have some granules. We have some ribosomes. And yeah, the mitochondria actually has its own DNA, which is pretty cool. So there are 3 steps in cell respiration. Part 1 is glycolysis. And this is actually the only part of cell respiration that does not occur in the mitochondria. Glycolysis actually occurs in the cytoplasm. Then we have the Kreb cycle. And then we have the electron transport chain. Both of those do occur in the, do occur in the actual mitochondria. Let's take a look at each step. So first, like we said, we begin with glycolysis. This occurs in the cytoplasm, and this part is anaerobic, so you don't need oxygen for this part. What happens is we have enzymes that are going to break the glucose, which is a 6-carbon molecule, into 2 3-carbon molecules. We call these molecules pyruvate. So from 1 glucose, you get 2 pyruvate molecules. In the process, since we are breaking glucose down a little bit, we actually do create 2 ATP in this process. So here we have our glucose. It's broken down, and we create 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. So 1 pyruvate and 2 pyruvate. In the process of breaking it down to make the pyruvate molecules, we're able to take 2 ADP and add energy to them in the form of bonds with lonely phosphates to make 2 ATP. We also start off collecting electrons with our electron carrier. So we have NAD+, we add electrons to it, that allows it to become NADH. So we are, So we are starting to collect our electrons that we're going to use later on as well. Next is the Krebs cycle. So the pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, and it is then broken down. Now we're only going to talk about 1 pyruvate right now. So for each pyruvate, it goes in and it's broken down into a 2-carbon molecule and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is released, and the electrons that were freed when we broke the pyruvate are added to NAD+ in order to make NADH. Excuse me. Coenzyme A is added, which will bond to the 2-carbon molecule, and it's actually going to help facilitate the formation of citric acid. So coenzyme A is going to help our 2-carbon molecule bond to a 4-carbon molecule that's already in the Krebs cycle. So this is going to turn it into citric acid. Citric acid is a 6-carbon molecule. We're going to take that citric acid, we're going to break it, and that's going to create a 5-carbon molecule plus carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide leaves. We make some more NADH as our electron carrier, and that moves out of the cycle. We take that 5-carbon molecule, we break it again down into a 4-carbon molecule. We're able to create another NADH plus 1 ATP. We then reform and rearrange that 4-carbon molecule. The 4-carbon molecule can now be used again. It can get recycled. Hold on one moment. Ripley is whining. I don't want that to fall. All right. Come on, viewers. There you go. Come here. Okay. Oh, you just want to play. That's all. Okay. Ugh. I can't play right now, little dude. I'm sorry. All right. So now that's what happens for 1 pyruvate. But remember, at the end of glycolysis, we had 2 pyruvate molecules. So if 1 pyruvate molecule makes 1 ATP, then since we had 2 pyruvate, we've made 2 ATP from the Krebs cycle. So here's that picture. We have pyruvate. We break it apart to make a 2-carbon molecule. Carbon dioxide leaves. We collect the electrons. Coenzyme A helps that 2-carbon molecule to bond with a 4-carbon molecule that's already in the cycle to form this 6-carbon molecule, citric acid. We break citric acid, carbon dioxide leaves, we collect the electrons, we have a 5-carbon molecule. We break the 5-carbon molecule, carbon dioxide leaves, we collect the electrons, and we've made a little bit of energy. We're left with the 4-carbon molecule. We rearrange that, collect electrons, and we're back to the 4-carbon molecule. It's going to be used again to create citric acid. So 1 pyruvate makes 1 ATP, but since we have 2 pyruvates, that means we made 2 ATP at this stage. So we have 2 ATP from glycolysis and 2 from the Krebs cycle. And last but not least, we have the electron transport chain. Now this can be very similar to the light-dependent reaction that we saw in photosynthesis. Remember how we had that electron transport chain there? We're going to see something very similar to that here. Remember, all throughout, we were collecting the electrons on the electron carriers. Well, all of those are brought to this point. Proteins in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion take electrons from NADH and FADH2. So what happens is the electrons that were collected are brought to these proteins and delivered to the proteins. Now that means that the NADH and FADH2 are losing their electrons. They're going to go back to their other form and go back to the Krebs cycle and glycolysis to collect more electrons. As the electrons are being passed from one protein to another, it draws hydrogen ions across the membrane. Now this allows the electrons provide energy that will allow the proteins to do this. They just pull the electrons onto one side of the membrane in order to create a larger concentration on one side. Oh boy. Now that we've had our, now that we have a larger concentration of hydrogen ions on one side, what we can actually do is allow them to flow down their concentration gradients by diffusing through ATP synthase, so that protein that has a channel in it, and allows the hydrogen ions to move from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. And as it does that, as the hydrogens flow through that protein, it generates energy like a water wheel. And this allows us to take a bunch of ADP, store that energy on it, and allowing it to form a bond with a lonely phosphate, turning it into ATP. Now at the end where the, what are they called? At the end of the electron transport chain, when the electrons are deposited, they will actually be picked up by some oxygen, and that will also attract some of the hydrogen ions and allow it to form water, and we will get rid of that water as waste. So this is why when you exhale, you breathe out some water vapor. So here's a picture. This is taking place in between. So we have the intermembrane space, the space between the outer membrane and the inner membrane. And this down here is the matrix. So the electron carriers drop off their electrons at this first protein. The electrons are moved from one protein to the next. As they are moving, they are drawing hydrogen ions from the matrix across the membrane to the intermembrane space. Now we're collecting a large concentration of hydrogen ions out here. Eventually, that concentration is going to get higher than outside here than it is inside in the matrix. That's going to allow the hydrogen ions to naturally diffuse from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration through ATP synthase. And as it flows through, it generates energy. That energy is taken and stored as a bond between ADP and a lonely phosphate, turning it into ATP. This will make about 32 ATP molecules. The electrons that were going through the electron transport chain are deposited on this last protein, picked up by some oxygen atoms, and between the electrons and the hydrogen ions being added back in, we're able to form water. Now we don't run out of hydrogen ions because NADPH doesn't just deposit electrons, it also brings more hydrogen ions as well. All right, so a picture to kind of summarize. First, the equation: 1 glucose plus 6 oxygen gas will give us 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water molecules plus about 36 ATP. And a summary of what is going on. Glucose enters the cytoplasm, goes through glycolysis. We are going to make 2 ATP there, as well as some electron carriers. Those electron carriers, the NADH, are going to move up and go to the electron transport chain. The pyruvates that are made as a result of glycolysis go into the mitochondria and enter the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle is going to make carbon dioxide, some more carbon dioxide, all the carbon dioxide is made here, and make 2 more ATP, and it's going to make some electron carriers. Then we go to the electron transport chain. All those electron carriers deposited the electrons and hydrogen ions here. The hydrogen ions help to generate the energy by moving across ATP synthase, creating about 32 ATP, and their electrons are picked up by oxygen along with hydrogen ions to make our water. All right, so fermentation. We've actually mentioned fermentation before. We had a whole section on it in a previous chapter. We're just going to kind of remind you about it. Now, cells are not able to store a large amount of oxygen in order to do cell respiration. So cells that cannot get a whole lot of oxygen for whatever reason, then they're going to rely on glycolysis and fermentation in order to make energy. Since oxygen isn't present, they can't do the Krebs cycle. Or they can't do the Krebs cycle, they can't do the electron transport chain. All they can do is glycolysis. Now, as we saw, or as we said in the past, because glycolysis, we already said that it doesn't require oxygen, and fermentation is anaerobic, that means it also does not require oxygen. That's the nice thing about these processes, that you can do them without needing a whole lot of oxygen. However, remember, they don't make a whole lot of ATP. Glycolysis only made 2 ATPs. So not a whole lot is made, which is why we cannot sustain our cells with just glycolysis. However, when you do strenuous activities like working out, and you may not be able to provide as much oxygen to your cells as they require, they can do glycolysis for a bit in order to make just enough energy to keep you going for a little while, but eventually you do have to stop, catch your breath, and that allows oxygen to return to your cells, your muscle cells, in order to keep them going. All right, so now some additional resources. Woo! First, we have a Science in Pajamas video on cell respiration. So enjoy my craziness. Then we have some other videos. We have Amoeba Sisters, Cellular Respiration, and the Mighty Mitochondria. We have Bozeman's Science on cellular respiration. And we have the Amoeba Sisters on fermentation. All right. So I definitely recommend that you check those out. I will post a link for this Prezi into the video description so you have access to those links. But in the meantime, you guys, just stay awesome, stay curious, stay safe and healthy. All right, you guys, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.